Imagine looking out of a satellite window and watching a country erase its own desert. Not in a century, not in a decade. In just 1 year, the yellow turned green, the sand retreated, and the entire world stared at their screens, unable to believe what China had just accomplished. This is not a nature documentary about slow change. This is the story of how one nation declared war on the largest deserts on Earth and moved billions of tons of sand using machines, manpower, and engineering so aggressive that scientists called it the most ambitious environmental project in human history. Northern China is home to some of the most brutal deserts on the planet. The Gobi Desert, the Taklamakan Desert, the Mu'us Desert, the Tengger Desert. Together, they cover over 1 million square kilometers of land, and for decades they have been growing, swallowing everything in their path. Every single year, the deserts of northern China expanded by approximately 3,600 square kilometers. That is an area larger than the entire country of Luxembourg, disappearing under sand annually. Farms buried, villages abandoned, rivers choked with dust, life retreating mile by mile. By the 1990s, the situation had become catastrophic. Sandstorms originating from the Gobi Desert swept across northern China, turning the skies above Beijing completely black. Residents wore masks for over 80 days per year just to breathe. The capital of the world's most populous nation was being suffocated by its own land. Over 400 million Chinese citizens lived in the direct path of advancing desertification. Their farmland was dying, their water sources were vanishing, their communities were being buried under waves of sand that no wall or barrier could hold back. China was losing territory, not to an army, but to nature itself. The economic damage was staggering. Desertification cost China an estimated $65 billion in lost agricultural production, damaged infrastructure, and health impacts every single year. This was not just an environmental crisis, it was an existential threat to the nation's food security and economic survival. China made a decision that would reshape the geography of an entire continent. In 1978, the government launched the 3 North Shelter Belt program. The world would come to know it by a different name, the Great Green Wall, the most ambitious reforestation project ever attempted by any civilization. The scale was almost incomprehensible. The project would span 4,500 kilometers from Xinjiang province in the far west to Heilongjiang province in the far east. It would cover 13 provinces and affect nearly half of China's total land area. The goal was to plant 35 million hectares of new forest by 2050. But planting trees in a desert is not as simple as digging a hole and dropping in a seedling. The Taklamakan Desert receives less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year. Summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Winter temperatures plunge below -20. Sand dunes shift constantly, erasing any trace of human effort within days. Before a single tree could be planted, China had to solve the fundamental problem, the sand itself. You cannot grow anything in sand that moves. Every gust of wind reshapes the dunes. Every storm buries whatever was planted the week before. The desert does not stay still long enough for roots to take hold. The solution came from an idea so simple it seemed almost ridiculous: straw. Ordinary agricultural straw left over from wheat and rice harvests. Engineers realized that if you push straw into the sand in a grid pattern, each square roughly 1 meter by 1 meter, the straw breaks the wind at ground level and stops the sand from shifting.
Millions of tons of straw were transported hundreds of miles into the heart of the desert. Convoys of trucks crawled along roads that barely existed. In many areas, vehicles sunk into soft sand and had to be pulled free by tractors. Supply lines stretched across some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Teams of thousands of workers spread across the desert floor, laying straw by hand in the scorching heat. Temperatures regularly exceeded 49 degrees Celsius. There was no shade, no shelter, no relief. Workers dug shallow trenches and pressed bundles of straw into precise grid formations under conditions that would break most human beings.
From the air, the result was extraordinary. The desert floor transformed into an enormous golden checkerboard stretching to the horizon in every direction. Each square was a tiny fortress against the wind. Together, millions of these squares created a barrier system covering thousands of square kilometers of previously unstoppable desert. The straw checkerboards did more than just stop the sand from moving. Over weeks and months, the buried straw began to decompose. Wind and dew carried moisture into the grid squares. Microorganisms colonized the decaying straw, creating a thin layer of organic material. The desert was developing something it had not had in centuries: soil. Once the sand was stabilized, the next phase began. Mechanical augers and specialized planting machines moved across the checkerboard grids, drilling small holes at the center of each square. Desert-resistant seedlings grown in dedicated nurseries were carefully transplanted into each hole. Species like saxaul, desert poplar, and red willow, chosen specifically for their ability to survive extreme conditions. Each seedling was positioned so its roots reached just below the surface, where the straw layer provided shade from the killing sun. Workers added precisely measured amounts of water and compacted the soil around each base, ensuring root contact with whatever moisture existed below. Every single seedling represented a calculated investment of resources, labor, and hope. But hand planting alone could never match the scale of the problem. China deployed drone seeding technology. Specially designed drones carrying thousands of seed pods flew over vast desert areas, releasing seeds encased in biodegradable nutrient shells. A single drone could seed an area in hours that would take human teams weeks to cover. The seed pods were engineered to penetrate the sand surface upon impact. Each pod contained the seed itself, plus enough nutrients and moisture-absorbing gel to sustain germination without rainfall. When the occasional desert rain did fall, the gel expanded, absorbing water and feeding the developing root system beneath the surface. Water was the ultimate limiting factor. Without it, nothing survives in the desert, regardless of how many seeds are planted or how much straw is laid down. China solved this with an engineering approach as ambitious as the planting itself. They built water infrastructure across the desert at industrial scale. Along the 522-kilometer Tarim Desert Highway, engineers installed 86 solar-powered pumping stations. Hundreds of photovoltaic panels at each station generated electricity to pump groundwater from depths exceeding 100 meters. This water flowed through underground pipeline networks and was distributed through precision drip irrigation systems. Over 200,000 trees along the highway corridor alone were kept alive entirely by solar-powered water delivery. Not a single drop of this water came from rainfall. Every molecule was pumped from deep underground using energy harvested from the same brutal sun that made the desert uninhabitable in the first place. But the innovation went further. Engineers elevated the solar panel arrays approximately 2 meters above the desert floor. This created shaded zones beneath the panels, where soil temperatures dropped significantly and moisture retention increased dramatically. Desert-adapted plants like licorice, red willow, and hawthorn began growing in these artificial microclimates. The Desert Highway became the world's first carbon-neutral desert expressway. Sunlight generated electricity, electricity pumped water, water sustained trees, trees absorbed carbon dioxide. The entire system was self-reinforcing, a closed loop of engineering and ecology working together in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Alongside the solar-powered irrigation, China deployed an army of heavy machinery across the northern deserts. Bulldozers scraped sand from agricultural land that had been buried by advancing dunes. Excavators dug channels to redirect seasonal water flows toward newly planted areas. Graders leveled terrain for windbreak forest belts. The scale of earth moving was extraordinary. In some regions, hundreds of machines operated simultaneously, removing millions of cubic meters of sand from buried farmland and villages. The sand was relocated to designated containment zones where it was stabilized with straw grids and vegetation. The desert was being physically pushed back by industrial force. Simultaneously, engineers constructed thousands of kilometers of windbreak barriers. These were not just rows of trees, they were engineered multi-layered defense systems. Tall trees at the back caught high-altitude winds. Medium shrubs in the middle disrupted ground-level gusts. Low grasses at the front trapped sand particles before they could accumulate into dunes. These windbreak systems were planted in strategic corridors identified through satellite analysis and wind pattern modeling. Each corridor was positioned to intercept the dominant sandstorm paths that historically carried desert sand toward populated areas. The barriers did not try to stop the wind, they filtered it, removing the sand while letting the air pass through. The results, after just 1 year of intensified operations, were staggering. China reported that desert area had been reduced by 2,424 square kilometers in a single 12-month period. That is not a slowing of expansion, that is actual reversal. The desert was physically shrinking for the first time in recorded history. NASA satellite imagery confirmed the transformation independently. Data from the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectrometer showed that China had become the single largest contributor to global greening. The increase in vegetation was equivalent to the entire Amazon rainforest in terms of new leaf area added to the planet. Scientists at Boston University, analyzing 20 years of satellite data, concluded that China alone accounted for 25% of the global net increase in green leaf area. A quarter of all new vegetation on the entire planet was coming from a country that just decades earlier had been losing land to desert at an alarming rate. The environmental impact extended beyond just stopping sand. The newly planted forests and vegetation belts were absorbing over 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually. Sandstorm frequency dropped by 82% compared to the 1980s. Dusty days in previously devastated regions fell from over 100 per year to just 30. Underground water tables in reclaimed areas began stabilizing as root systems held moisture in the soil instead of allowing it to evaporate. Local rainfall patterns showed measurable increases as vegetation released moisture through transpiration, creating microclimate feedback loops that attracted even more precipitation to formerly arid zones. Communities that had been abandoned for decades were rebuilt. Farmers returned to land their grandparents had fled when the sand advanced. Schools reopened in villages that had been ghost towns. Roads were constructed connecting reclaimed areas to provincial networks. The desert was not just being stopped, it was being replaced by civilization. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. Former desert regions began producing almonds, walnuts, dates, and other drought-resistant crops, generating billions of yuan in agricultural revenue. Desert tourism emerged as a growing industry, with visitors paying to see the transformation firsthand, riding camels through areas where forests now bordered sand dunes. But not everyone celebrates unconditionally. Critics raise important concerns about the long-term sustainability of China's approach. Many ecologists warn that monoculture reforestation, planting mostly fast-growing poplars, creates vulnerable ecosystems. When disease struck, over 1 billion poplar trees were wiped out across northern China, erasing years of progress overnight. Scientists also point out that aggressive irrigation in desert regions depletes underground aquifers faster than they can naturally recharge. Some experts argue that the green coverage may be temporary, that without sustained water inputs, many planted forests will eventually die as groundwater levels drop, creating a second wave of desertification, potentially worse than the first. China's engineers acknowledge these concerns and have begun shifting strategy. Newer projects emphasize mixed species planting using combinations of native trees, grasses, and shrubs that create self-sustaining ecosystems rather than artificial forests dependent on human intervention. The goal is transitioning from engineered greenery to genuinely resilient natural landscapes. Despite the debates, one fact remains undeniable. China looked at deserts that were swallowing its nation and refused to accept defeat. It mobilized millions of workers, invested over $100 billion, deployed cutting-edge technology, and physically moved billions of tons of sand to reclaim land that nature had abandoned. The desert has not been defeated, not yet. Perhaps not ever completely, but it has been pushed back, measurably, visibly, verified by satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above the Earth. And that single achievement in the span of just 1 year amazed every scientist, engineer, and government watching from around the world. China proved something that no other nation had demonstrated at this scale: that desertification is not a death sentence, that sand can be moved, that life can return to places where it vanished generations ago, and that with enough determination, even the most hostile landscape on Earth can be forced to bloom again. What do you think about China's war against the desert? Can humans truly defeat desertification, or will nature always reclaim what was taken? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story amazed you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible engineering story from this channel.